All right, what's up, everybody? We are now live. I'm super excited tonight because I kind of teased you guys on the last show last week that I was getting on a good buddy this week who knows a lot of Jags football. And not only does he know a lot about Jags football, he also knows like the ins and outs, the X's and O's. So I'm super excited to have my buddy Dalton on. Dalton, how's it going?
It's going well, Jason. Yeah, appreciate you hitting me up. Glad to be here. Talk some Jags football.
Yeah, I mean, for those, I mean, again, if I don't need to give him any hype up, he's pretty big already in the Jags community. He stays a little quiet sometimes, but every once in a while he'll pop off on Twitter with some good stuff. So make sure you follow his Twitter. It's down there below his frame there. Like I said, Dalton knows a lot. Me and Dalton have played football together. We went to the Kansas City Chiefs game. We got to hang out with you and your lovely wife down there in Kansas City in the playoff game. That was a lot of fun. And so we're going to get into all things draft. We're going to get into all things Jags and all that. But not yet, okay? Because on this show, we're a very niche show. Not only do we talk about the Jaguars, we also sprinkle in like how to be a better person and life lessons and things like that. And I gotta say, I'm super proud, and I want to hear because we talk about all the time on this show about guys being like dads to their kids and how important that is. And Dalton not only has a 2-year-old son, but now has a daughter on the way and expecting. So Dalton, how are you going to prepare now, not only for a second child, but you know that daughter is going to give you some problems in about 12 to 13 years. How are you going to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a one step at a time approach there, Jason. Enjoy it while she's young. I will say I'm looking forward to, my son is very much a mommy's boy. So, they say, daddy's girl's a real thing. So I'm excited about that. Maybe having a kid that's attached to me the way my wife has my son attached to her. So super excited. I'm sure it's going to have its own challenges, but we'll enjoy the younger years before we get into the teenage years.
We were talking about this. We have a lot of dads that watch this show and didn't know how that was going to happen, but they always do a special shout out. So if you are a dad with older ones and you have any tips for Dalton for as they age, feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you have any questions for Dalton, if I know we had one that just had a kid like last month we were talking about on the show. So I know it's a weird channel, but that's kind of what we do around here. So if you feel any tips for them as you're talking about the Jags, feel free to share some wisdom. So Dalton knows the game, played football a long time, about as long as me, understands it a lot. We're coming up on a week and a half, almost a week from the draft. So let's just start with the question that's looming. If in a perfect world, kind of realistically, who would you want the Jags to take at 17?
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded question. I mean, if I had to give a bland answer and then I'll throw a player out there, take the best football player they can get. I think they've done a pretty good job in free agency of filling holes. That's given them some flexibility in the draft. I think anytime you reach for a position, and we've seen that around here a lot, reaching to fill holes, whether it was last year with some of those picks, second, third round, reaching to fill holes. I just want a good football player. I think there's enough opportunity on this roster to make an impact at almost any position. So, whether that's a wide receiver, a defensive lineman, um, defensive back, I mean, even an offensive lineman, I'm all in on any of those. Just take the best player. So I think it'll be interesting to see kind of where the runs happen early on. Quarterback, I think receiver, tackle is another one where I think there's some good, really high level top end talent and some really high end developmental talent. So curious to see how the board starts to run. But I don't know. I'm a huge Brian Thomas fan. I don't know. I think the guy's just a freak. You talk about frame, length, ability, vertical ability. I don't know. Something about that guy just tells me there's a lot more there than what we've already seen at LSU. And I think he would be a great addition. I also think you could see an edge like, Jared Verse um, drop to 17. I think some people may get caught up in his size and him being a tweener. So those are a few guys that I really like that I could see dropping to that 17 spot.
So now I know the whole Quinyon Mitchell guy probably won't draft a 17, but if Quinyon Mitchell did draft a 17, is that a guy that you would want them to take?
Yeah, I mean, I think he performed super well at the Senior Bowl against high level competition. I think he's got tested, really, really well. I think what you see on film matches what you heard going into some of the Senior Bowl and scouting combine. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a pick that anyone could, shrug their shoulders at. I think it'd be a great addition to the team. I think corner is obviously a position of need. They did fill, some of that basic need by signing Ronald Darby, who I think will play outside. That's what history tells us. So, yeah, adding another good corner there certainly is something I'd be able to. And I think he's probably one of two I really like. Terry and Arnold would be the other one. Not a huge Kool-Aid McKinstry guy. I just don't think at 17 the value's there for me, but I know others seem to be intrigued by him.
So if Jared Verse and Quinyon Mitchell are both there at 17, who would you want the Jags to take?
I'd take the edge. I'd take the guy who's going to affect the quarterback. And I think there's position versatility, especially in Ryan Nielsen's defense, with not only Jared Verse but with Trayvon Walker, with Josh Allen. I mean, I think you start to look pretty multiple up front with what you can do. So yeah, I would lean defensive line. I just think they make a greater impact to the game.
So the latest mock draft that because I like PFF I for I don't necessarily get all caught up in the grades and
Yeah.
looking at the number grade and saying that's how they performed, but it gives you a lot of insight on how many snaps people played at what positions, things like that I like. So and I like their writers too. Their latest mock draft had defensive tackle Johnny Newton mocked to the Jags. If that happened, how would you feel about that?
Yeah, I actually think I'd feel good about that. Another position I think where you need to add some bodies. He's someone I think, when you got towards the latter part of the college football year, he was really talked about, really high level prospect. Kind of as you got into the draft, some of the draft talk, he kind of seemed to fall down on the boards. And then as we've circled back towards getting closer to the draft, he's a name you're hearing more and more in that first round. So, I mean, a guy who can play three technique, he's really a gap guy, does well penetrating upfield. Again, think there's a real fit there in the defensive scheme we have. So, yeah, I would certainly support that. I think, again, highly productive guy, got the measurables, seems like a guy Trent Baalke would like in, seems like a fit for the defensive scheme. So,
I gotta ask you about something that's been weighing on me the last week. Okay. And I've actually kind of changed my mind about where I want the Jags to go. And I'm not even really sure what I want them to do. But we're 100 days removed from the end of the regular season. So we've had some time to kind of look back and we've let things marinate, look at positions of need. We've gone through the first round of free agency where we've lost the big guys, we brought in the big guys we're gonna bring in, and I think that we all see the glaring holes at defensive back, at wide receiver, and although I do think that those are huge glaring needs, I still, even though we're 100 days out, can't get the bad taste of the offensive line out of my
yeah.
mouth. And I look at the what Trevor went through. And I went through the injuries he sustained. And not only am I priority number one, protect Trevor. That's it for me. That's it for me. Whatever. But if you add into that additionally, we also couldn't run the ball at all. I think offensive line was a major struggle. Now I know we added Mitch Morse at center, but there's something in me that just feels like that's not enough and that we could be having this conversation at the end of next season with Trevor, who again was injured, and an offense who couldn't run the ball. And we're going to be kicking ourselves thinking, why didn't we draft another offensive lineman in the first round? Because we know we're going to have injuries at somewhere at tackle at some point or somewhere at guard. Do we really even know what Ezra Cleveland's going to give us? Do we even really know what Brandon Sheriff's going to get us? So are you fine with skipping out on offensive lines in round 1 and 2 and kind of rolling into it with what we have?
It's a tough question. Back to what I said, I don't want to reach to pick someone. I do think there's quite a bit of good guard depth and interior line depth in this draft. I would be totally open to taking one in the first or second round. I think the first round for me is there's a few guys I like, but again, I think there's only a few really top level guys that play tackle in this draft. Really, I think one Joe Alt is to me the only sure thing. I think the guy from Penn State. Even the guy from Oregon State who some see as a tweener, maybe a guard, maybe a tackle. I just think there's enough good players at the interior offensive line that you can find a really quality player in the second and or third round. I do think somewhere in those first three rounds that you do need to add depth. I think the interior offensive line is really the issue. I think if you look at tackle, at least for next year, you've got Walker Little, you've got as a depth guy, you've got Cam Robinson starting, and you have why am I drawing a blank on the guy who plays right tackle?
Anton Harrison.
Anton Harrison. Yeah, exactly. So I think you've got good depth there and versatility with Walker Little to back those spots up. But I do think we're a little light on the inside. I do think I'd like to add a little bit more beef there. Maybe get a road grader. And I think there are quite a few of those guys in this draft. So I think somewhere in the first 3 rounds, you need to be addressing the interior offense line.
I like I said, I just can't seem to get it out. Like I just remember every week complaining and blaming the offensive line for all of the issues. Like
Yeah.
couldn't even. I mean, like we're gonna get a Press Taylor here in a second because we got some news about that from Trevor today.
Yeah.
But like even looking at, I think Press Taylor took a lot of blame as a play caller because he was so hamstrung by the inability to run the ball up the middle and by the inability to give Trevor any time to make throws down the field. And I just, to me, there may be other ways to address it, but
I would agree.
I like what we have. I like Cam Robinson. I like Anton Harrison, but Cam only played in half the games last season, right? And I know in a perfect world we want him to play all the games. And I know in a perfect world Walker Little is quality depth, but Walker Little played a lot last year, and we still had these issues. So to me, and again, you're right. I mean, you end up in a position where you're reaching for a guy in the first round just because you want to protect Trevor. But at the end of the day, like I was saying, I think the most valuable asset you have on this team is Trevor Lawrence. I think he's more valuable than your receiving core. I think he's more valuable than your defensive backs. I think he's more valuable than your defensive ends. I know how important that position is. But if Mac Jones is out there, it doesn't matter if Brian Thomas is out there or you trade for Brandon Ayuk or you go and do something crazy like that, because at the end of the day, it goes as Trevor goes. And I'm just very concerned that we're kind of rolling it back with the same squad plus Mitch Morse. So maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe I'm overreaching that. But you mentioned best available player. We know Trent Baalke is a best available player guy, which is not a bad thing. But is there a position that like if Brock Bowers is there, is he off the table if he's the best available player, or a player like that where maybe we're okay, but like maybe in the second round if there's a running back there that they have on their board, or heaven forbid a linebacker they have on their board as the best available player? Like, are those positions off limits to you?
I don't think so. I think that mindset is dangerous. Again, part of being successful as an NFL franchise is sometimes replacing the talent you have with cheaper, better options. So again, if you fall into the trap of reaching and avoiding just acquiring talent, I think you can get in a tough spot. So while it probably wouldn't be something that people want to see, if you've got someone that falls in your lap that is just you got them graded higher on the board, I think you got to take them. Now, if they're close and you have a positional need, obviously I would lean positional need. But if you've got someone fall in your lap, if Brock Bowers falls in your lap at 17, and if they value Brock Bowers as a prospect higher than what's available, I would give them no fault. Because one thing Brock Bowers does allow you to do is it does add versatility to your offense. I mean, he's a pretty damn good inline blocker, but also really a threat in the passing game. And you could flex out Ingram. So I think, there's opportunity there for a guy like Bowers to still impact your team at a high level. And I think the level of prospect he is would probably be greater than most of which other prospects fell in your lap there.
So we know Trent Baalke likes to trade up and down. And you see all sorts of, every fan base wants to trade up. I mean, everyone does. I mean, and so at the end of the day, because of how talented this draft class is, it's going to require a little bit more than usual to move up in this draft. Is there a guy that you would like to move up and get, and what would you be willing to give to get that guy?
I was thinking about this when you sent me what we were going to talk about, and the Roma Dunze thing has been very popular. I think I'd only be willing up to get a prospect and it probably would be Roma Dunze. I know it's the popular one. I don't know that there's really anyone else. Again, maybe a Jared Verse, but I don't think I'd be willing to move up more than a few spots. I think there's enough really good football players in the first round that are going to be available to you. And I just don't think they're in a spot to give away draft capital. I mean, I think they got to keep churning this roster. They got to keep getting younger. I know they're a fairly young team technically, but they've got to replace some of the positions and older spots they've got. And I think giving away a ton of draft capital would be a mistake. outside of going to get like Marvin Harrison Jr., but you're probably giving away most of your draft stock for that. So I don't know. I think they're in a really good spot. I think there's enough talent at each position. I would, again, I'm probably beating you to the punch. I'd probably rather move back depending on what falls than move forward.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was going to ask you because again, if I'm a guy that I'm kind of in on offensive line now. Like I've convinced myself, and for better, and this is what just too much idle time does. It makes you just like question things too many times. I would be okay with trading down and getting an offensive lineman and maybe picking up a third or a fourth round pick because, like you said, we got to start replacing some of these people. You know, these Roy Robertson Harris, these Devon Hamiltons, even a Luakon, I know is locked up long term, but your Brandon Sheriffs, your Cam Robinsons, like right, like you got guys that you're gonna have to replace eventually because you're not gonna be able to keep them with their salary cap. So trading down, I know it's not sexy, but it might be the smart strategy depending on how their board goes. Um, but you kind of talked about corner. You kind of talked about like who you'd kind of want there, but so you're locked in. You would take the wide receiver there to help Trevor out. You think that's our biggest position of need at this point?
I don't know if it's the biggest position of need, but when I look at the talent in the draft at wide receiver, I do think you can still get a really, really quality player in the second round. Don't get me wrong. But to me, it's, you don't just find elite receivers walking on the street. I know the Calvin Ridley experience didn't really end the way we wanted to. I do think he was as high level as a receiver we've had. For whatever reasons, some things that weren't always the cleanest or worked out the best. But I just think there's a handful of guys in this draft that are really got the opportunity to be elite. And if one of them's there, Brian Thomas again, somebody who gives you extremely good size, speed, guy's just a freak. He's just a guy I'm really intrigued by, and he could end up being a bust. But I don't know those measurables, that tape. I see a lot there. But I think I had a tweet about 2 or 3 months ago, and I kind of leaned back to it is somewhere in the first 3 rounds, you should be getting a receiver and an offensive lineman. I think this draft is really well stockpiled in both those positions. So even if you waited to get receiver in the second round, you had a lineman you really liked. I don't know, maybe they like Amarius Mims. I mean, that guy is a freak. I mean, total freak. Could be the tackle of the future to pair with Anton Harrison. Like, it's hard to fault any of those. I think one thing I try to take a step back of is not being overly judgmental of every move. Every fan gets mad when somebody trades for someone and it's not their team. Well, there's 32 teams. Everyone can't get everyone. So, not that I totally trust Trent Baalke, but I would like to see, if they have a board and they have evaluated the talent, I think they have to stay true to who they believe is the best player. And, they've added to the front office to help evaluate that talent. For me to get emotional or think, oh, that's the wrong pick. Like, I mean, these guys get paid a lot of money to do this. I mean, I may have my opinions, but at the end of the day, I think you have to trust your board and trust that you're valuing talent over need.
So I want to get to a little bit later, and for those of you that are just joining us, and because I know people come in late, right? We do shows every Tuesday at 9 p.m. If you're just coming in late, this is my good buddy Dalton. He's very informed on the Jags, been a Jags fan his whole life, much like me. Understands football. You can already tell has great opinions. We're glad to have him on. We are going to take a short break here in about 5 or 6 minutes or so, just to reset the Zoom call. And I do want to get to kind of what you think could happen with these picks that Baalke has made over the last 2 years. But before we move on to that, I kind of want to stay on the theme of where we could go immediately. And with the extension of Josh Allen, we've freed up some money. And so now there's a possibility we could absorb one of these free agents. The first one I got to ask about, the one that everyone's always talking about, is Brandon Ayuk from San Francisco. I know his cap number jumps up this year on his fifth-year option. Is that somebody that you would like to see the Jags make a move for? And if so, what would you be willing to try to give to get him?
Yeah, so I think he is someone, if you talk about a fit, he's someone certainly that fits what Doug Peterson likes to do. They really value route running. I think that's why they really valued Calvin Ridley, who's historically been a very good route runner. And so Brandon Ayuk is one of the better route runners in the league. Obviously adds tremendous size, athletic upside. So, yeah, I mean, who wouldn't love to have Brandon Ayuk on the team? As far as what you'd be willing to give up, I mean, you're going to have to pay him, right? And there's no scenario where you would trade for a player like that if you can't agree to a term contract doesn't make any sense. Um, I'm not great at like the draft capital. I think everyone always throws out picks like this equals that. I'm not really sure. You know, it's probably going to take a first round pick, I would imagine. Um,
Is that something you would give up for him?
uh, that's tough. I mean, again, it'd be hard to be down on it. You're getting a player to help really support your franchise quarterback, someone you're investing into a long term deal. I just think you get in a real funny spot if you start paying these long term contracts to people. I'd rather draft a guy at 17, I think, than trade the 17th pick for a receiver that you're going to have to pay what $20+ million a year.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of with you. I understand the value he brings to the team. I mean, I understand that like technically we're still in this Trevor window of his rookie deal. But yeah, I mean, you, you can't really go rent a guy. I mean, Houston's, renting a guy right now, and it could work, but I'm kind of with you. Obviously, it'd be awesome to have an amazing player in Brandon Ayuk, but that's not the way you have sustained success, I don't think. And
I agree.
with Trevor being a guy who said he wants to be here long term and a guy who says he wants to stay in Jacksonville, I feel like we need to make moves that's best for the franchise long term. And that's why I was a little worried about some of these restructurings they did the last few years that kind of pushed the money down the road a little bit. But the salary cap's a myth anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and it's just going to continue to go up. And I also think they got quite a few outs in these deals. So, a lot of these are basically 2-year deals. So I think if there's one thing people should be able to give Balky credit for is the guy knows how to move the money around. He's fairly good at that. So,
What about a guy like Xavier Howard who's still out there? Is that a guy? Do you have any? I mean, is there any other guys out there that are still free agents that you would have some interest in potentially?
I have not really, if I'm being honest, studied the free agent market all that much. Xavier Howard's, I think, a solid player. Um, Again, I think it comes back down to fit. They got Gabe Davis. I think they like what they've gotten him. Obviously, I think Christian Kirk was having a phenomenal year before he got hurt. Yeah, I think any depth is fine. I wouldn't pay big for depth right now. I think as long as your depth is quality. So I would rather add some players on a 1-year deal that are maybe third, fourth guy that you can count on. But I still think adding a guy in the first or second round is going to be someone who can impact your football team pretty greatly. I think there's quite a few guys in the second round. Troy Franklin, Tez Walker. I mean, there's a handful of guys I think could really impact this team and bring a dynamic of vertical threat that we just don't have.
Yeah, yeah. I tried to convince myself into Xavier Howard. For some reason in my head was thinking that Ronald Darby would be able to come in and play some sort of nickel. Um, but I know they got Savage for all that. What they say, anyways. But we're gonna take a quick little break. It's gonna be 3 minutes max. We're just gonna reset the Zoom call. We're gonna be right back. So don't go anywhere. I'm gonna get Dalton's thoughts on what he thinks about the news of Press Taylor still calling plays and what he thinks potentially some of these second and third year Trent Baalke draft guys could potentially do. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back in a couple of seconds. All right, we are back with Dalton now. We just had to reset the Zoom call. So if you have any questions for Dalton, make sure to, I'm just going to edit this a little bit here. Put it in the chat. We'd love to answer it. During our little break, Dalton said he wanted to clarify some thoughts on Xavier Howard. So,
Yeah, it's been a long week, as I mentioned to Jason prior to this call at work. So yeah, Xavier Howard, obviously defense back, former Dolphin. He was on quite a bit of decline in the last year or so. If you can get him at a reasonable price, I think he could definitely be quality depth that maybe could have a bounce back year and impact your team. I'm not spending any sort of premium dollar. Again, you could do a 1-year deal, maybe just a 1-year deal to add that depth to the team and potential playmaking. But outside of that, nothing really long term or substantial for me that interests me with Xavier Howard.
the only thing that interested me was just kind of like the possibility if you could go receiver, O line, and then bring him in for depth, and you could kind of roll into the season with what you have. I just can't get
Yeah,
past the thought that like in the NFL nowadays, I just feel like the goal of the defense is just like bend but don't break, and just hope that the offensive team commits a penalty that makes them punt. Like I feel like that's
Yeah.
just like what the strategy is. And I know some goodies teams that were in the playoffs and the Super Bowl, they had good defenses, and I know the Chiefs had a good defense, but when you look at the winners in the past, it's just basically who can score touchdowns. And so,
Yeah.
as time goes on, I just find myself like wanting to commit more to offense than defense, and even through the draft. Um, so that was the only thing, just because, again, like I've said 100 times, I'm a Trevor guy. I want to set Trevor up for success. If that's taking receiver, O line, then do it, right? If that's receiver, O line with your first four picks, I'm good with that too. So that's just the only thoughts that I have, just because I think I mean, look at every defensive position. Like they're all becoming devalued. Like off ball linebackers are devalued, safeties are becoming devalued. Like your interior defensive linemen are just basically like they just are gap stuffers now. Like they don't like it's great if you have a guy that can get pressure from the interior, but that's not really their job anymore. It's just basically to stuff the interior of the gap. Um,
Yeah.
and so I just you're seeing these positions get devalued, and I don't want to be this team that keeps investing in these positions that you could probably go cheap on. Just with how competitive the NFL is, you got to make the most of every dollar you have in the salary cap. And I'd like to see that kind of go to even edge, right? Like you said, getting pressure on the quarterback.
Yeah.
It's just kind of that's just kind of what I'm thinking along those lines. But Lord knows what Trent Baalke will do. And before we get to his previous draft picks, today Trevor Lawrence spoke to the media. I think Alua Khan did too. But what stood out the most was they asked Trevor Lawrence who he anticipates calling plays this season, and he said he anticipated Press Taylor calling plays, and additionally, he liked Press Taylor calling plays. So, what are your thoughts on that whole situation?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to ignore people. People in the profession in the building. Doug has a lot of investment and trust and press, and so does obviously we're getting the same thing from Trevor. So I mean, there were certainly times last year where I thought the rhythm of the play calling wasn't great. Some of the situational football was pretty obvious. But I also think, you made a great point earlier. Is I mean, if you can't block it up, I mean, especially on the interior, if you can't keep those guys from getting in the quarterback's face or penetrating on run plays, it's going to be hard to be successful. So I know I would sit in the stands and hear moans and groans about the screenplays. Well, I mean, the reason they're running that many screenplays, they can't block it up interior, so they're trying to get basically stretch run plays on the exterior with ETN and some of their other skill, Agnew, to take advantage, of some sort of semblance of a run game. So certainly was handcuffed a little bit in what he could do at times with the talent up front. I think it's just wait and see. Again, I think Doug has proven to be a pretty good play caller. Um, so the fact that he's stepping back and continue to take that CEO role of the team, I think you know we'll have to see how that plays out. He's live and die by Press Taylor right now, though. So if he's going to be in control of the offense, we're putting all those eggs in that basket, and ultimately, that could cost Doug. I mean, that could be something that we look back on and say it was a mistake. But I do think it's hard to say it was a mistake when, to your point, we couldn't block anyone up front.
I've actually, I've taken a lot of flack because I have actually been one of Press Taylor's defenders. Now, is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But if you look at kind of what we know, right, there's a lot of things that kind of point to Press Taylor not being as bad as everyone thinks, right? So we know that his entire career he's learned under Doug Peterson. So for me, I can't imagine that Press Taylor's play calling is much different than what Doug Peterson's would be because it's all he's known. It's probably very similar. The second thing we know is that Doug Peterson is in the headset of every single play call that Press Taylor makes.
Yep.
So it's not like the headset's off and Doug Peterson's like off doing something else. Like he's in the headset hearing the play calls. He has veto power. He sets up the game plan with Press Taylor the week before, so he's a lot more involved, I think, than people think. It's not like one of these defensive coaches that hired Press Taylor and just letting Press Taylor run wild with it, right? It's a much more different dynamic. And the third thing we know is multiple times we know that Trevor Lawrence checked out of plays to plays that didn't work. And again, I'm a Trevor guy, and he's got to learn from that. But I feel like that Press Taylor gets a lot of heat from times oh, why didn't you run a QB, or why did you run a QB sneak from the 2 yard line? Well, he didn't run a QB.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like uh,
Well, part of that is your quarterback's not comfortable running quarterback sneaks. I mean, that is a known fact with Trevor. He is not comfortable sneaking the ball.
yeah, and the biggest thing, like you said, like it's impossible to run a game plan if you cannot run the ball. Absolutely
Yeah.
impossible. I mean, you just can't do it. I mean, even teams that don't have any like solid running backs on their team, they still can hand the ball off and get 2 yards. We couldn't even get
Yeah.
2 yards. So like we couldn't even put ourselves in a 2nd and 8 situation. So we just struggled a lot. I mean, ETN, like I thought he played well at the beginning of the year, and then it's kind of, I don't know, just toward the end of the year,
Yeah.
the blocking just got worse, or teams figured us out, or for whatever reason.
Yeah. Uh,
Um, but again, if Trevor's likes press and Doug likes press, it seems like the ones that don't like press are the fans, right? And
yeah.
and I know people kind of, fans don't get enough credit because we see things all the time, and then they gaslight us, and then we were right the whole time. So like that happens, but
For sure.
I'm just not as worried about Press Taylor. I don't think that's a big issue for this team for me personally.
Well, I think, you made another good point there about, how much of the game is controlled at the line of scrimmage, right? Trevor has full autonomy to do whatever he needs to do at the line of scrimmage to get them in the right place. So if you think of just about some of the greats, whether it's Tom Brady, whether it's Peyton Manning, they built a career off getting into formations, getting into the line of scrimmage, motioning, and really calling the play themselves from there. I mean, so yeah, you have a game plan. You want to scheme certain things up. You have areas you want to attack. Focal points for the week. But a lot of it is on Trevor to make sure they are in the right play, in the right situation. So again, it's a group effort. It's not all on Press. So I'd agree with you. There was times that I think as a fan you get irritated. I probably said negative things about Press Taylor, but I think one thing I always went back to is what you just said is Doug's in the headset. He's not making these calls independent of Doug. They are game planning together. Um, yeah, he's in the headset. He knows what's going on. He can veto anything he's hearing that's not a good idea. So again, I don't think it's much different from what we were going to get from Doug. Again, I think Trevor's got some growth to do at the line of scrimmage, but also, I mean, they got to be able to block it up. And I did have a question for you on this, and I don't know if it's as much of a myth. I don't know if you've ever broken this down, but I do believe there's some validity to it. And I don't know if it's a Trevor thing or maybe Doug's scheme. They seem to really struggle with cover two. Like, I mean, I don't know if that's a Trevor thing or if that's a scheme thing, but anytime there's two high safeties, it really seems like that's given the offense issues. Have you ever broken that down or really seen that? I know you've done a ton of film breakdowns.
Yeah, I mean, so uh, the sad thing is that teams could play cover two against us. Like when you
Hmm.
play good offenses, like you have to kind of get into a cover one. You kind of have to press at the line of scrimmage, especially teams like the modern NFL is that short to intermediate passing game. And that's
Yep.
what cover one or cover three, I mean, that's what it does for you. It takes away the middle of the
Yep.
field, it takes away some of the short routes at the line of scrimmage. Teams didn't have to do that. They could get pressure with 4 guys and sit back into cover two and drop into a zone and watch Trevor's eyes and have him just read his eyes and make a play on the ball when they see it. The biggest problem I
Yeah.
think is like I said, they could get pressure with 4. If you can't get pressure with 4 and you have to send a 5th guy and a 6th
Yep.
guy, you can't play cover 2 behind that. It's just impossible. You don't have enough players. So teams being able to get pressure on Trevor with 4 guys allowed them to sit in the most advantageous defensive formation. And so that's my big problem was the offensive line. If you can
Yep.
block those 4 guys and you give Trevor 5 seconds back there. It doesn't matter what coverage you're in, but they know that they can rattle Trevor, and with just 4 guys getting at it. So I think that's why he struggled the most is because that's the most advantageous position for a defense, and they can just sit back, split the field with their safeties. They could play. A hard corner that sits in the flat. They can move the linebackers out to the flat and have the corners drop into kind of a cover 4 type look, and that's just hard on a quarterback with no time. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that's why you saw it the most. And yeah, and it's just like, especially toward the end of the year, teams are like, we can blitz and get a sack. So let's save that for third down. Let's save that for fourth down. And let's just play this cover two behind on early downs. So
Yeah.
that kind of just cycles back to my issue with the offensive line being the biggest issue, in my opinion. Um, and not, the bigger issue, and I know there's a lot of issues here. I'm talking about the offensive line. I think the biggest issue is Trent Baalke and how he drafts. I think that's single handedly our biggest problem. If you point to last season, not a single person outside of Anton Harrison really helped us last year. You could point at a couple plays Parker Washington made. You could point at a couple plays Antonio Johnson made. But outside of those two guys, not a single. And we had a lot of draft picks last year. It wasn't like we only had like one every round. We had a lot of
Yeah.
draft picks last year. Not a single person really helped this team. So, do you think? And we'll just start with just this last year, with this last previous year, with the Tank Bigsby, with the Brenton Strange, with the Ventrell Miller, any of those defensive line guys that are, I guess, on the team. I don't know. And do you see any of those guys like taking a second year jump and actually contributing to this team?
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention earlier on offensive line is that I'm curious about how this staff, an organization, people in place develop talent. I would agree with you. I think some of the draft picks are kind of head scratching. They, I think Trent's thought process was we're in win now mode. We've got some clear potential holes of depth we need to fill, and I think there was a lot of reaching going on last year. I think they reached for players and positions that they thought they needed. I'm with you. There was not a lot of impact last year. Anton Harrison seems to be a slam dunk. We'll see. It's 1 year, but it was a really good year. But yeah, I mean, getting a tight end that really couldn't contribute on the field, really had a lot of penalties and struggled at times in the second round. And then, Tank Bigsby, I will say, if I'm being honest, I think there's something there. I know it was a terrible rookie year. I didn't hate the pick. Um, I think from a contribution standpoint, it's back to the offensive line. Like really hard to contribute if you can't run the ball. I mean, we couldn't even get ETN. I think a healthy number of carries throughout the year of what you'd like to see from a player like that. So I think running the ball was just an issue altogether. But yeah, I don't know. Ventrell Miller's another guy I really really liked. I don't know if I love the pick because of how much we've invested at linebacker already, but I do think the value was good at that spot. Again, gets hurt, has no real impact. Not sure how he's going to bounce back. So curious to see how that works out. And then, yeah, I think there's a lot of other picks that were just, you know, just I'm not even sure what the thought process was. Obviously, guys they like maybe their trades, but we haven't seen the impacts. I'm not sure we've heard anything that tells us we can expect any kind of impact. So from the draft as a whole, I thought it was a pretty big failure, and I'm with you. I think there was a lot of reaching and need filling because they thought they were going to have a really big year last year, and that short term vision can lead to some long term failures.
I I get liking the player and I get draft the player, but like Tank Bigsby was like I don't want to say running back two, but I mean it was 1A 1B up there in Auburn when he
Yeah,
played there. Brenton Strange,
yeah,
I could be convinced he was the third best tight end at Penn State the year he was drafted. So I mean, we're looking like
yeah,
I think you're right. I think they went and drafted for for depth. I mean, Ventrell Miller, I like Ventrell Miller, but if you were to ask me like what he would be in the NFL, he's a special teams guy, right? I mean, I
yeah,
think, and maybe with the new kickoff rules, we'll see him. But he never was a guy, even in college, who could play sideline to sideline. And if you can't play sideline to sideline in college, you have to be able to do that in the NFL. Like there's no room in your starting
yeah,
roster for a guy that can't play sideline to sideline at the linebacker position. Even some of these like bulky linebackers we've had in the past, like guys like Paul Puzzlesny, and they were a
yeah,
lot better getting lateral than people realize. But it's
yeah,
just those. I haven't seen him really. I'm not, besides Trevor Lawrence and besides Travis Etienne, um, Anton Harrison. I know Tyson Campbell. He was a guy we were all excited about until this last year, who admittedly, even before he got hurt, wasn't playing great. Um, I'm not seeing a lot of picks that Balky's making that's really helping this team. And when you look at teams that are successful, they're backfilling their depth and even starters with late round picks. So
yeah,
maybe it is not being able to develop talent once they get here. Maybe it's talent evaluation from the front office. But I think if we were to back the scope all the way up at the biggest problem with this team, and there's a lot, I think you could nail down the biggest problem to being we are unable to draft players who are helping this team outside of the first round.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's been a problem around here for a long time. This regime isn't any different. And I think if you point to the year where Urban was here, I mean, I think it was pretty clear that was an Urban draft. I mean, look at the players, the schools they came from, who they were as high school players. I mean, there's a familiarity with those guys from Urban. Those were Urban guys. And I think for the most part, it was actually a pretty good draft. Now, I don't think that's the way you can attack the draft every year, but I do think, they leaned on just guys who had been really productive, have always been very talented, always been highly valued. And again, that's probably not the way to go about it each year and each pick, but it was clear that that draft was far more successful, and it did have a little bit of Urban's fingerprint on it. One thing I'm interested about, and again, um, how adaptable is Trent Baalke? I think as any human being in any profession, if you're not adaptable, it's like grow or die mentality, right? If you're not adaptable, if you're not willing to change, look at things differently, bring in other people around you to challenge your mindset, you're not going to be very successful. So I'm curious. They had the addition of the gentleman that worked for the Jags previously, then was at Michigan. I don't recall his name, but it's back with the Jags. They seem to have a little bit of success when he was there. I'm just curious. Some of the people in that corner, are they all yes men, or are there people challenging Trent on some of these evaluations and picks? And I think we're going to see it. I mean, I think we'll be able to tell here in a week or so, kind of how that board's being evaluated.
I'm pretty excited about this draft. I mean, I think there's a lot of good talent in this draft, so it may be hard. It may be hard to miss in this draft. Hopefully, it just me. Obviously, I don't work for the Jags. I have never talked to Trent Baalke, but just like kind of reading him and the way he talks in press conferences and the way he answers questions from reporters, doesn't seem like he's a guy that's too adaptable. I mean, he's still trading
Yeah,
for guys that he drafted in San Francisco. So I mean, like he like is it's doesn't seem like he
I
really
would agree.
is evolving with the game, and that's
Yeah.
probably my biggest concern.
I think a little bit of my hope might be is I know Trevor's team. I know there's been some things from high level players on our team and even through the organization of like, suggestions or, hey, I think we need to focus and do these things. So again, I think Mitch Morse was a big deal for me of like potentially maybe Trent Baalke is showing some ability to change his mind on things. For him to draft a guy who was fairly successful as a rookie and then basically have to admit he was wrong after his second year. We haven't really seen that. We haven't seen him admitting he was wrong, and that's what he did. I mean, when you sign Mitch Morris after you've invested that pick and that guy who started for you for 2 years, you're essentially telling everyone, I screwed that one up and we need to get better. So, I am curious to see how that plays out in the draft. We hadn't seen that at a whole lot of other positions though, interior offense line being one of them, the other positions. So I'm not saying he's a changed man, but I'm curious to see that mindset and how they attack the draft. Historically, he's been a traits guy, which I do think is fairly important, but he's taken traits over production a lot of times, and I think that's where I get caught up. Is traits are great, but if the person's never produced and you're drafting them in the first half of the draft, I mean, you better be a hell of a development, hell of a developing team. Like you better have a lot of investment in how you develop these guys, or what's the what do what's the real objective there? So I don't think they've shown that they're developing guys at a high rate. I think they've acquired guys that are high level talent. We've seen them be successful. And then the guys who have the traits who need to be developed, I don't know that we're seeing that.
I would I would I don't know if I will give Trent credit for admitting he's wrong about Fortner because of how bad Fortner was on film. Like
Yeah,
you couldn't even look anyone in the eyes and say that he's right now at a starter caliber level. He
I
was
think it was
that
the
bad
words
on
I
film.
heard the words I heard at the press conference prior to them replacing him. And you're not going to come out and just say the guy was terrible, but it didn't sound like something they were going to address. And so I was a bit taken back when they did address it. Like, okay, well, that's not what we just heard you say. Again, maybe not admitting publicly what you're going to do privately, um, but yeah, I'm with you. Like, I don't know they had a ton of choice, but it was a guy who did have some success as a rookie. So you could have said, okay, maybe it was just the line as a whole had issues. Maybe we're gonna, I think they could have easily talked themselves into thinking he could have a bounce back here.
Which is what I think they're doing with all the offensive linemen this year. But we'll see if that's what happens.
Yeah.
All right, last thing I want to ask you about before I let you get out of here, and this is coming from like the comments here, and I'm going to kind of
Okay.
piggyback off this comment and ask you here. The question was from Jaggernaut. What's it going to take for Shaw to move on from Baalke? But I'll take it a little bit step further and have a hypothetical here for you. If the Jags go 7-9 again next year, um, what do you think happens with the coaches, Trevor and Baalke? Does anything change? Um, what do you see happening if this team has another year where they miss the playoffs?
All right, so a couple things. I hope they get the Trevor deal done in the offseason because I'd hate to see what happens if this team fails and they're clearing house. I don't think that bodes well for confidence in re-signing your quarterback. Yeah, I mean, I think if they are not an over 500 team, if they're not a playoff team, I think you have to make change. I mean, you're in the window of your franchise quarterback to go be successful. I know he's going to get his second contract, but we have to take advantage of these prime years of Trevor Lawrence and some of the other players we have on the team. And if Trent proves once again he can't put a roster together to do that, I don't think there's any choice but to move on. I'd also lead into saying it'd be very hard, in my opinion, to fire Trent without firing Doug. I don't know who's going to come in as a lame duck GM and just accept a coach. The only way that would work is if you're hiring a GM with history that has history with Doug Peterson. Only way it works, and good luck with that. I would be of the opinion if you're firing the GM, fire everyone, start over, hire GM, find the right coach, move forward.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have the quarterback in the building, and you if you draft a couple decent players this year, you'd have a good little nucleus. Now, we don't want that to
Yeah,
happen, and we hope it won't happen.
no,
But yeah, after I mean, this is 2 years in a row now where they were at 500. So it's not outside the possibility of questions for it to happen again. Just hopefully with the development on the growth and all that, we'll see steps taken forward. I think with Houston coming in and putting some pressure on you as well, it hasn't made things really nice in the building for people. I don't see any of the other teams in the AFC South getting worse. So I think
yeah.
there's a lot of pressure this year.
I think Houston's a perfect example. I think when they made the hires they did, I mean, a lot of people on social media and Twitter said this, but I mean, when they hired D'Amico Ryans, it was just like, and then the way he spoke about the front office and who they put in place to GM, it was you saw pretty clear alignment from top to bottom of even before they played a game. Like, man, this is going to be successful. And then they hit on the quarterback, and it all just kind of fell into place. And to your point, is like I just don't think that's going anywhere. I mean, D'Amico Ryans, I mean, just seeing what he did in year one, I mean, you're going to be in for it to win that division every year. It's going to be tough. And the other teams are kind of in rebuild mode, but they're going to catch up quickly if you're not doing something to sustain success. So it is, one thing I still am having a hard time fathoming from last year is how the 8-3 to falling off a cliff. I mean, I know offensive line play was poor, but I mean, you were 8-3, so it's just it's very tough to see that, and I don't know what happened, and I'm a believer in sports that momentum is real. I know a lot of people and analytical people don't believe that, but I do. I think if you're a human being and you're in a locker room or you're seeing success or seeing failures, that's contagious. So the season couldn't have started any better, and for the fall of a cliff like that was pretty tough to watch. Especially when the year before was a complete adverse. So it was almost like 2017 to 2018 where they started the season 3-1. It's like, oh, they're going to win the Super Bowl. They just blew out the Patriots, and so I'm really interested to see how they kind of start the year. And, we've got about, what, 4 or 5 more months to build the roster. I think it'll be super important. I think they do have some cap flexibility to add some depth pieces or just even some one year pieces, to keep them competitive. But it comes down to the draft and what they can do during the draft. And yeah, I'm curious to see if it's kind of the same old where we're reaching for traits and not really getting quality proven players, or whether we're adding proven players to the roster. So
We're going to learn a lot here, like you said, in the next week or so. It'll be pretty exciting, and hope to have you back after the draft, and
yeah, absolutely.
we can kind of speculate what we think will happen after that. Before I let you go, I got to tell you a pretty funny story. I was at a Jags game, one of the games toward the end of the season, and I saw your brother
Huh.
walking with someone who looked, I thought, a lot like you. Now maybe
Okay.
there's no telling what state I was in, but I could have sworn it
Okay.
was you. And I walked up to who I thought was you, and I made some derogatory comment, as friends would say when they see each other,
Mm-hmm.
in passing. And then the guy turns and looks at me, and it's not you. And
Oh man,
so I was
that's
like,
too funny.
they all started laughing at me. My friends started laughing at me, and I was like, "Oh, you're not Dalton," but he was with your brother. I was a little thrown off, so I was.
Yeah, man,
It was
that's too funny.
it was pretty funny. But I hope to see you at some games this year. I'm sure we'll run into each
Yeah,
other. I know
if
you
you
got your
ever need
plate
part,
full. I know you got your plate
if
full,
you ever
cook.
need, if you ever need parking, let me know. I've got a
Okay.
lot downtown.
All right. Well, they are closing down my Toontown spot, so I will be in the
There you go.
looks for a new place to tailgate.
I'm
So
a 5 minute walk, less than half a mile from the stadium.
I love it. All right, I'll be hitting you up. Well,
Yeah.
Dalton, I appreciate it, man. Thank you for your time. I put his Twitter under there. I kind of undersold his Twitter earlier. He's pretty active on Twitter. I don't know if he gets as involved as some of his friends on Twitter when it comes to some
Hmm.
things like that, but he is active and does talk a lot of things about sports. So make sure to give him a follow on Twitter. And again, man, thank you for your time. I know your time is limited and it's about to be more limited. And good luck with your future endeavors with your family.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jason. Thanks a lot. We'll see you, buddy.
You guys have a good night. I will see you guys on a show very soon. Until then, go Jags.